The sound of metal handcuffs clicking shut echoed across the pristine waterfront as Karen Morrison, president of the Lakeside Estates HOA, was escorted toward the police cruiser. Her perfectly styled blonde hair had come undone during the struggle, and her designer blazer was wrinkled from resisting arrest. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she shrieked at the officers, her voice carrying across the manicured lawns where neighbors had gathered to witness the spectacle. "I have every right to verify ownership in this community. I am the HOA president." The officers remained professional as they guided her toward the vehicle, while she continued her tirade about property values and community standards. Behind them, I stood on my own front porch, watching the woman who had made my life miserable for weeks finally face the consequences of her actions. 3 weeks earlier, I had pulled my moving truck up to the impressive waterfront mansion I had just purchased in Lakeside Estates. The gated community was known for its strict HOA rules and million-dollar homes, but I had done my research and could afford the monthly fees and regulations that came with lakefront living. The property featured a stunning 2-story colonial with wraparound porches, a private dock and manicured gardens that stretched down to the lake's edge. As I unloaded boxes, I noticed a woman in her early 50s approaching with a clipboard and an expression that screamed authority. She was impeccably dressed in a navy blazer and pearls, her blonde hair styled in a perfect bob that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She introduced herself as Karen Morrison, HOA president, and immediately began asking pointed questions about my purchase. "I wasn't aware this property was on the market," she said with a suspicious tone, her eyes scanning my modest work clothes and older pickup truck with obvious disdain. "The previous owners, the Hendersons, were very established members of our community for over 20 years. They never mentioned selling to anyone." Her tone implied that surely they would have consulted her before making such a decision. I politely explained that I had purchased the home through a private sale after the elderly couple decided to downsize and move closer to their grandchildren in Florida. Karen's eyebrows raised skeptically as she scribbled notes on her clipboard, clearly documenting everything about our interaction for future reference. Over the following days, Karen's questions became increasingly intrusive and her visits more frequent. She would appear at my door with various forms and demands, citing obscure HOA bylaws that supposedly required additional documentation. "I need to see your mortgage approval letter," she announced during one visit, her voice dripping with skepticism as she tapped her manicured nails against her clipboard. "And I'll need copies of your tax returns to verify your income matches the property value. We've had issues with fraudulent purchases in gated communities across the state." When I politely declined to provide personal financial information beyond what was legally required, her demeanor shifted from suspicious to openly hostile. She began making comments to other neighbors about how I didn't fit the community profile and questioned whether someone like me could legitimately afford such an expensive home. The situation became even more uncomfortable when Karen started showing up with other HOA board members in tow, treating my property like a crime scene that needed investigation. During one particularly awkward encounter, she brought along Margaret Chin, the HOA treasurer, and Robert Kim, the secretary, both of whom looked embarrassed to be there. "We just want to make sure everything is legitimate," Karen explained to them, loudly enough for me to hear from my front porch. "You can never be too careful these days with all the mortgage fraud and identity theft happening." Margaret and Robert exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly recognizing that Karen's behavior was crossing professional boundaries, but neither seemed willing to challenge her directly. The harassment escalated when Karen started sending certified letters demanding proof of ownership, claiming that several neighbors had expressed concerns about my presence in the community. The letters, written on official HOA letterhead, contained increasingly threatening language about potential legal action and violation fees. One particularly ridiculous letter demanded that I provide a notarized statement from my bank confirming the source of my down payment, along with 3 years of employment records and character references from previous neighbors. I dutifully provided copies of my deed, title insurance and property tax records to the HOA office, but Karen continued her campaign of intimidation. She would drive slowly past my house multiple times a day, sometimes stopping to take photos of my property and vehicles with a professional-looking camera. I caught her measuring my lawn ornaments with a tape measure, claiming they might violate the community's aesthetic guidelines. During one particularly uncomfortable encounter at the community mailbox, she accused me outright of squatting in the home. "I've been in this community for 15 years, she said with a smug expression, adjusting her designer sunglasses dramatically. "I know when something doesn't add up. Real homeowners don't act defensive when asked simple questions about their legitimate ownership." Her voice carried that condescending tone that suggested she considered herself the neighborhood's unofficial sheriff, responsible for protecting property values from undesirable elements. The situation reached a breaking point on a Tuesday afternoon when I returned from work to find Karen standing in my backyard, peering through the windows of my home office. She was holding her phone, apparently recording everything she saw. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached. "You're on private property without permission." Karen turned to face me with an expression of righteous indignation. "I'm conducting an HOA inspection," she declared, as if that gave her unlimited access to my personal space. "I have authority to verify that this property is being maintained according to community standards." When I pointed out that she had no legal right to enter my property without notice or consent, she became even more belligerent. "I'm not leaving until you prove to me that you actually own this house," she stated firmly, crossing her arms in defiance. I had reached my limit with Karen's behavior and decided it was time to involve the authorities. While she continued to film herself and mutter about property rights and community oversight, I called 911 and explained the situation to the dispatcher. The police arrived within 15 minutes, and I met them at my front door while Karen remained in the backyard, still recording and taking photos. Officer Martinez, a patient man in his 30s, listened to both sides of the story and asked to see the relevant documentation. I provided my deed and property tax records, which clearly established my ownership of the home. When he approached Karen to explain that she needed to leave the property immediately, she launched into a lengthy explanation about her authority as HOA president and her duty to protect the community from suspicious residents. Officer Martinez remained calm but firm as he explained to Karen that HOA authority does not supersede property law and that she was currently trespassing on private property. "Ma'am, you need to leave this property immediately," he said in a professional tone. "The homeowner has asked you to leave, and you have no legal right to be here without permission." Karen's response was to double down on her position, insisting that she had every right to verify ownership and that I was the one who didn't belong in the community. "I'm not going anywhere until this situation is resolved properly," she declared, her voice rising to a shout. "This is about maintaining the integrity of our neighborhood." Officer Martinez exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Chin, and they both moved closer to Karen. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for criminal trespassing," Officer Martinez announced, producing his handcuffs. What followed was a scene that I'm sure the neighbors are still talking about months later. Karen began screaming about police harassment and demanding to speak to the officer's supervisor, but her protests fell on deaf ears. As they placed her under arrest, she continued her rant about property values and community standards, even as the handcuffs were secured behind her back. The entire spectacle was witnessed by at least a dozen neighbors who had come outside to see what all the commotion was about. As Karen was led to the police car, still shouting about her rights and threatening to sue everyone involved, I felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction that justice was finally being served. Within 2 weeks of Karen's arrest, the HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her from her position as president. The board issued a formal apology to me for the harassment I had endured and assured me that such behavior would not be tolerated in the future. Margaret Chin, who had been elected as the interim president, personally delivered the apology letter and explained that several other residents had come forward with their own stories of Karen's overreach and harassment tactics. Apparently, I wasn't the first homeowner to be subjected to her aggressive investigations, just the first one willing to involve law enforcement. The legal proceedings moved swiftly through the court system.